Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Brent. I will not waste any time on adding any more to that, but thank you for having me. Glad to share some of what we have learned in Central Oregon. And so I'm going to be speaking about day-neutral strawberry production in Central Oregon and the high desert region of Central Oregon. And I understand that Brent already talked about June bearing systems, so I just wanted to touch a little bit on what day-neutral strawberries are. So I just want to make sure, is this showing fine? Just because I can't see my computer. Looking good? Hopefully. Okay, great, thank you, sorry. So with day-neutral strawberries, different from June bearers, they flower regardless of day length, as long as temperatures are between 40 to 85 degrees. And they produce fruit in the first year from when they're planted, which is a benefit for who I work with, are diversified vegetable farmers. And so it's nice for them to be able to throw a strawberry in the mix that will actually produce in that first year. And then they fruit throughout the growing season, as long as the temperatures are in the favorable range. And there's usually a dip during the hottest part of the summer because it's usually over 80 degrees. They are usually planted about 12 inches apart in beds that are spaced 3 to 4 feet. So that photo in the top corner there is showing the planting spacing that I used for my trial. And they're often planted into some sort of ground cover, whether that's plastic mulch or landscape fabric, and that's to keep the weeds down and keep the daughter plants from rooting. And then they are managed as mother plants, different from the matted row system that Brent would have talked about. So you keep that mother plant as its own unique plant by removing the runners through the year. So that lower, or through the growing season. So that lower photo there is just showing how you keep the plants as a single plant. In Central Oregon, they're grown for 2 years. So I know in other places, including, I know Brent, in Utah, some people grow them just for 1 year, but in Central Oregon, if the farmers are doing day-neutral strawberries, they keep them in the ground for 2 years. So this is just to give an idea of what the growing situation is that we're dealing with in Central Oregon. It's the high desert region, might look similar to some parts of Utah. It's pretty, the natural vegetation is pretty rough. It's fairly drought tolerant plants. We have shallow soils. And then small farmers in the area, mostly vegetable growers, are sort of turning this landscape into some small farms. So that's just an example of what one might look like, kind of plopped down into this semi-arid area. So the main sort of limitations that we're dealing with in Central Oregon are, it's a low precipitation zone. So 10 to 12 inches a year, most of that would come as snowfall in the winter. The elevation range, it's variable anywhere from about 2,000 to 4,200 feet, but most of the vegetable growers and the farmers that would be growing these strawberries are more in that 3,500 foot range, I would say. We typically say that the plant hardiness zone is about 3 to 5. So if people are ordering plants, that's what we recommend they aim for. And the average growing season, you can see in that little chart, it shows maybe some of the names of those towns or cities will sound familiar to some people. Average growing season in the area is about 90 days, but it depends exactly where in Central Oregon you are. So as you go a little further north in the region, you actually go down in elevation and you get a longer growing season. But again, most of the growers I'm working with are really farming around that Bend, Redmond, Sisters area, because that's where the highest populations are. So if they're selling fresh market produce into those areas. We have hard freeze. It's very common that we still have hard freezes into even mid-May, and then also as soon as early to mid-October. So those are actual, below 28 degrees, maybe 25 degrees. And then we say in Central Oregon that frost is possible any month of the year. So it's quite common to have frosts in the summer months as well. And then as you probably have the same situation, a very wide swing in temperatures between day and night due to those that high desert. And so this is obviously a challenge for perennial plants because it causes premature budding and then they get frost damage with our late frosts. So why is this important for strawberries? Brent already talked about temperature management and those critical temperatures in strawberries, especially those freezing temperatures in May are going to cause damage to early blossoms. And these are photos from my trial. And then at the end of the season, this is a photo at the end of September, we still were producing a lot of fruit on our plants, but then we typically get some pretty hard frosts or freezes in late September, early October. Hence the interest in high tunnels in the region. And so basically any farmer in Central Oregon who's a commercial horticultural grower, they already use high tunnels for vegetable production. So they're pretty common in the area, but fruit production is very limited in Central Oregon, and farmers had not been using high tunnels for fruit production. They use it for their kind of high value annual vegetable production. So the question was, what does high tunnel production of berries, specifically in this case strawberries, look like in Central Oregon? And is it worth it for growers? So what I'm going to be talking about today, sharing results. This was a Western SARE Professional Plus Producer grant. So I was working with 4 farms in the region that also grew strawberries. So I had a main research site where I looked at different types, different strawberry cultivars grown indoor or high tunnel in the field. And then farmers who collaborated with me, they had a version of the trial on their farm as well. So so what we were trying to do, we wanted to compare different cultivars of DayNeutral strawberries to see how suitable they were to growth in Central Oregon. There hadn't ever been any sort of research or trial in Central Oregon. So we were interested in how did the plants do? How did they do over winter? How was the yield, obviously, and with these different cultivars, what was berry quality like? Because these are all direct to consumer producers. So they're selling either at the farmer's market or through a CSA, or some of them might be selling to a restaurant. And then we wanted to evaluate how the strawberries did both in the high tunnel and the field, and with the ultimate goal of helping growers decide whether it's worth it for them to grow strawberries in Central Oregon. And then on top of that, is it worth the investment of using one of their high tunnels for berries? So we looked at 4 cultivars of DayNeutral strawberries, and those were Albion, EB2, Mara des Bois, and Seascape. So all of them are cold hardy cultivars known for fresh market production. Albion is sort of an older standby, and I won't talk about all of them right now, but we can, if you have questions, we can talk about it as we go. I will say one thing about Mara des Bois. It's known already to be a smaller berry. It has a unique flavor. But all of these the cultivars were picked based on interest from the growers. So I went off what they were interested in. And so different from some of the systems that Brent described in Central Oregon, what we did was we planted these in the spring. So we planted in early May, which is actually later than I would have liked, but we had a delay with just due to availability from the nursery. But they were planted in the spring of 2019, both in high tunnel and field. You can see the little picture of the trial down there. And then the yield and quality was tracked over the 2019 and 2020 growing season. So it was 2 years. And so the berries stayed in the ground for those 2 years. We did not replant the following year. So I just want to share some overall highlights of the trial. So again, planted in May 2019, we collected data during 2019 and then again in 2020. So across both years, both the first and the second growing season, EV2 was the cultivar that was the highest yielding, both in the field and the high tunnel. And then that was followed by Mar de Bois, Seascape, and Albion was by far the lowest yielding in our trial. Again, in both years, the plants that were grown in the tunnel, they had higher berry yields than those that were in the field. And in 2019, the differences were smaller than in 2020, the second growing season. So 2019, both the high tunnel and the field were fairly close to 1 pound per plant, and that's over the whole growing season. And that was averaged across the 4 cultivars. And then in 2020, there was quite a larger difference between those grown in the high tunnel, so around 2 pounds per plant, whereas the field, it was only 1.5 pounds. And that is the total marketable yield that we collected over the whole growing season. The 2019 growing season length was quite similar between those grown in the high tunnel and the field. And this is not surprising considering they weren't planted until May. And so there wasn't that much time for over the growing season for there to be a big difference between the two systems. And 2019 harvest started around July. So planted in May, started getting some fruit in July, but it didn't peak until sort of late August, September. Whereas the 2020 growing season, so this was the second season of these strawberries, the growing season length was about 4 to 6 weeks longer in the high tunnel than the field, but that depended on the cultivars. Some cultivars it was quite a bit longer, other ones there wasn't as much of a difference. So here's the overall data, and I'm going to talk about different parts of this later on, so don't get overwhelmed by this table. Tables are sometimes difficult to look at, but here we have broken out by year. So first year, establishment year 2019, then the second growing season in 2020, the 4 different cultivars, and what I was mentioning, total marketable yield. So that's all the berries we collected over the growing season that were actually marketable in the yield results in the field versus the tunnel. So you can see that in 2019, as I mentioned, there wasn't a huge difference between field and tunnel, but the tunnel yields were higher. And then what's interesting, if we look at this column, high tunnel yield effect, if we think of it as the percent increase from the yield we got in the field to the yield we got in the high tunnel, you can see that there was more of a yield effect for Albion and EV2 as cultivars, whereas Mar de Bois and Seascape, the yields didn't change that much between the high tunnel and the field. And then here, I'm going to talk about year 2, the yields. Here we did see quite a big difference, or a larger difference between those that were grown in the field and then in the high tunnel in the second year. So these plants have been established. We were getting yields for some of the varieties of more than 2 to 2.5 pounds per plant over that whole growing season. And these little letters beside, I should have mentioned, these mean that there's a significant difference between the different cultivars. So just down the one column here. And you can see that in 2020, across all the cultivars, there was more of a difference of yield increase from field to tunnel. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the fruit size and percent cull data, but I just wanted you to be able to see that we did take data looking at the size of the berries and also how much of a cull there was. And so there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the field and the tunnel, but berry size did tend to be larger in the tunnel than the field. And then cull, there was also not a huge difference. In 2020, we had more cull in the tunnel because we had actually more rodent and bird damage in the tunnel than the field, which might be something common for people in high tunnels. So another way to look at the data, which can especially be useful if you're thinking of growing berries and wondering sort of when the highest demand for your labor over the season is to look at the weekly harvest profile. So I'm just showing this for 2020 because it was, now the plants are established and there was a larger difference. And here we're looking at just two cultivars, EB2, which was the highest yielding, and Albion, which was the lowest yielding, and looking at the weekly yield in pounds per plant. And you don't need to worry that much about the numbers, but it's more just to look at the shape of the curve and get an idea of when the peak season was. So it really high tonal production peaked in late July. And then you can see, high tonal is the solid lines and field production is the dashed ones. So high tonal production peaked in late July, but then in the hottest parts of the summer, it tended to dip and then kind of came back up early fall. And whereas field production actually peaked midsummer, which provides a pretty nice complement to that high tonal production. So if a farmer was interested in maintaining production all season long and had the energy to pick strawberries all season, they could have both high tonal and field production, and they would actually have a pretty good consistent production all season. Keeping in mind, you have to have labor available during all of those times of the summer. Another way to look at it that can be really useful is to think about the effective harvest season, which is actually, as opposed to looking at the total yield, this is looking at once you hit 20% of your total yield, and then once you hit 80% of your total yield. So basically looking at your peak harvest season. And this chart gives a good visual just to see the differences between the cultivars and to be able to see in the second growing season when they came on and who came on sooner. So Mara des Bois was clearly the earliest yielding variety. And you can see here that Albion came on the latest. And basically for each cultivar, the main season started about 2 to 3 weeks later in the field than the high tonal. So really that time gain, the season extension gain for us is at the start of the season. So in the spring or early summer, getting an earlier start, because what happened in both years for us in Central Oregon is that the high tonal at the end of the season, we ran up into actually hard freezes, not just light frosts that the high tonal did not provide enough protection. So once you hit the hard freeze, it didn't matter if the plants were in the high tonal or in the field, everything shut down. Last sort of data to look at is strawberry production over 2 years. And I'm including this because at least the growers that I work with, they think of it as a 2-year investment. And so they want to know, okay, if I'm going to have these in the ground for 2 years, what can I expect for yield over that 2-year period? So in this chart, what we're looking at, the green bars are field production and the pink bars are tunnel production. And then the lighter shades are 2019, so that first growing season, and the darker shades are 2020, the second growing season. And we're looking at marketable yield, so total marketable yield in pounds per plant over that period. And then we have the 4 different cultivars along the bottom. So you can see, and it's pretty clear from this chart that in the first year, there was not as much of a difference between field and tunnel, especially not for Mara des Bois and Seascape, as I mentioned previously. But once you got to the second season, once the plants were established, they started growing earlier that second season. That's where we really saw the effect of the high tunnel. So we saw larger jumps in yield in the high tunnel. And if we look at EB2, which was our highest yielding cultivar over 2 years, if you're growing them in a high tunnel, you would be getting almost 4 pounds per plant in 2 years. So what I've included here on the side is just a little exercise thinking through what this might mean in terms of production and economics. So if you average across the cultivars, your average yield in over those 2 years in the high tunnel was about 3.2 pounds per plant, whereas in the field 2.3, so almost a pound greater in the high tunnels. And then if you think of a 14 by 90 foot area, which might be a common high tunnel size, within that area, you would produce, if you consider you have around 500 plants in that area at the plant spacing I mentioned, then in the tunnel, you'd be producing around 210 flats of strawberries, with a flat containing 12 pints of strawberries. Whereas in the field, you would have 140 flats. And the growers that I was working with, a conservative number for them was $4 a pint. And that was actually, if they were selling, I think that was their wholesale price actually. So if you took that number of 210 flats, then in the tunnel, you'd be around $10,000 in a 14 by 90 foot tunnel. Mind you, that's over 2 years. And then the field, it would be more like 6,700. So those are numbers not set in stone, but it gives a little bit of an idea in terms of thinking through, is it worth putting a high tunnel in? But then also you obviously have to keep in mind your labor and your own prices that you might get. So a little bit about the grower's experience, because as I mentioned, I did work with other, I had grower cooperators who also trialed these cultivars on their farm. And the yield rankings were the same as the main trial. So EV2, Mar de Bois, Seascape, Albion. All of the grower cooperators thought it was worth using high tunnels, and several of them wanted to use low tunnels in the spring to push their production even earlier. And then although EV2 was the highest yielding, the growers struggled. They found the berry to be fairly soft, and they found it hard to bring to market without bruising. And actually Albion was their favorite variety due to it had a really nice firm fruit and good flavor. And they found that outweighed the fact that it was lower yielding and had a late harvest. On the negative side, they found it difficult to keep up with both strawberry and vegetable harvest, because peak vegetable harvest is pretty much at the same time as peak strawberry harvest for us in Central Oregon, so sort of late August, early September. And overall, they found it was really important that you had drip irrigation, proper ventilation in your high tunnel, and that you used fertigation ideally. I don't think I'm a little short on time, so I won't spend a lot on this, but Brent and I are going to be coming out with a publication, so you can look at this online yourself once it's ready. But basically EV2 was the highest yielding, had nice fruit, but the growers were not very fond of it because it was soft. Mar de Bois highlight is that it has a really unique flavor, but it has a very small fruit size, which makes it harder to pick. Albion, what it's really known for is its excellent flavor and very firm fruit, but it was definitely lower yielding, and for us also had the lowest winter survival. And then Seascape was sort of a nice in between. It had good fruit, good flavor, firm fruit, but the fruit shape could be a little bit variable. So overall, what we found was that high tunnel, it seems to be worthwhile in Central Oregon. And if you really wanted to, you could complement it with field production. Brent talked about temperature management, optimal temperature management. And really, if you want to optimize your strawberry production, you really will need to open and close your high tunnel properly. Ideally, make use of low tunnels and shade cloth in the summer. But overall, the berry cultivars, they were well received by customers at the market. And I think really in terms of which cultivar to choose, it depends on the grower's criteria. And fairly impressive, all 3 of our cultivars all produced more than 2 pounds per plant in the second year, which is apparently a really good yield. just wanted to acknowledge funding and those who assisted in the project, and happy to take, and there's not much time, but a question or two.
I do want to leave time for a few questions. So if people have a question, type them in. I want to just kind of circle back while I'm waiting for some more questions to come in. Are people, I mean, you said $4 a pint is typical for your area. What's the range, and do they have any pushback? That seems pretty high, but
Pretty high. No, they live in a pretty wealthy area. They actually, some of the growers even said I could probably get more.
wow.
Was some of the feedback that I got from them. I think I'm trying to remember. $4 a pint might have been their market price, but I think it was. There's a chance that they were $3.50 for wholesale.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I'm sure they could get $4 or more at the market.
That's great. I think that illustrates the point that, you don't want to be competing against Walmart. You have a unique product and you price it according to the fact that it is unique and it's local. The other thing that I wanted to kind of emphasize, and that is that people contact me and say, which variety should I grow? And the answer is it kind of depends on your situation. I think it's interesting that although Albion, the yields were much less impressive. I mean, it's still quite good, but not as impressive as, say, Seascape or EV2, that because of that higher quality, and I assume most of your growers are looking at pre-picked sales. They're not doing pick your own or anything like that.
They're not, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one other question I had is if they aren't even thinking about pick your own, and if not, why not? And what would they do, pick a different variety if they were going that route?
Yeah. I had one of the growers in the study did after the study, he is interested in pick your own. And I think mostly because he didn't like picking strawberries. And there's no pick your owns in the region. So I think it would be a good fit. It might be too hot is the only thing. I mean, it's pretty hot during that season. Yeah. But I would say the other growers, why they weren't thinking about it, I think they already just have so much on the go. A lot of them, almost all of them, do a CSA and go to market and do wholesale production. And I don't think they want the idea of having people coming to the farm for one other reason.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. We do have a question here that came up. Why discard plants after 2 years? This actually came up in the chat instead of let's see, no, it's in the Q&A. Why discard the plants after 2 years? Why not keep them longer in your environment?
Yeah, good question. We basically, because production goes down, so yield, I think in a lot of places it peaks in the first year. For us, it definitely peaked in the second year. And although I didn't look at a third year, one of the growers in the study, they had already had plants in the ground and they kept them in for a third year, and they confirmed that the yield went down quite a bit, and they said they would never do that again. Mind you, that's one case, but generally the thought is that yield declines too much.
Okay, we're just about out of time for questions. I'm going to ask our next speaker, Alyssa, to pull up her slides while we're talking here just for a minute. But kind of that reemphasizes the point that I made with during my presentation, that first year and maybe the second year, those individual plants are the most productive. But then, since you're not generating new plants with runners and with like you do in the matted row, those plants just lose their capacity to produce yields and decent fruit size. So I've actually, just one side note before we move on, I've seen where people actually use that hill system where they plant in plastic mulch, fruit them until they start to kind of run down, and then cut the plastic open and encourage runnering and carry them through another year. But the challenge and that works better with June bears. With day neutrals, once they start fruiting, it's hard to get them to ever runner. But that's another approach. So Claire, thanks so much for that presentation. That was very interesting.